Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. I'm joined as always by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back to another segment of the Libertarian Angle.
Always great to be here with you, and of course our viewers and listeners whose attention to us and watching and listening to us, we of course greatly appreciate.
Yeah, and we appreciate the comments. We've noticed that some of our videos are creating some feedback, both positive and negative, and it's fun to read those and to interact with people. And we appreciate you watching and appreciate your feedback. Now, I thought, Richard, that it was time that we discussed the concept of free trade. I mean, that's clearly in the news. You've got all of the candidates bringing up the concept. You've got Hillary bragging about all of her managed trade agreements with NAFTA and the Trans-Pacific Partnership that she favors. And then you've got Bernie Sanders over there pandering to people in the Midwest by arguing for protectionism. You've got Donald Trump over here threatening to wage trade wars and erect tariffs. I don't know where Cruz and Kasich lie, but clearly they favor interventionism when it comes to trade, you know, things like sanctions and embargoes. So I thought, okay, it's time for you and me to discuss the libertarian case for free trade. And the way I see it, Richard, is that if you really believe in free trade, and of course we do, is that you don't need to manage anything. You don't need to control anything. You don't need to negotiate any agreements with other nations. You just unilaterally drop your restrictions on the ability of Americans to freely trade with other people. Now, why should you do that? Well, because that's the essence of a free society, or one of the parts of a free society, that it's my money, it's my property. If I want to buy from a Chinese, a Vietnamese, a Mexican, an American, that's my right as the owner of my own money. The government has no authority to decide who I'm going to trade with, who I'm going to sell to, who I'm going to buy from, that this is the essence of a private property system. Not only that, but free trade benefits people economically. It increases their standard of living. How do we know that? Well, because in every trade, a person will give up something he values less for something he values more, just by the nature of the trade. If he's not going to give up something he values less for something he values more, he's not going to trade. So it shows that just through the simple act of exchange, people can raise their standard of living. So the corollary to all this is that to the extent that government is interfering with this, managing it, controlling, infringing on it, government is not only damaging our liberty, infringing on our liberty, it's actually lowering our standard of living. And it's absolutely amazing to me, Richard, that after all these really decades, a couple of centuries of economists showing the benefits of trade and free trade, that we still have to make these arguments, that these politicians are still repeating the same old nonsense that has been promulgated throughout the ages by people that favor, you know, economic statism, socialism, interventionism, whatever word you want to put on it. The real key here in terms of liberty and raising people's standard of living is just unilateral free trade. Dismantle the embargoes, dismantle the sanctions, dismantle the tariffs, dismantle every impediment to the ability of the American people to trade with whomever they want to trade with. What do you think?
Well, I think that you've brought two of the essential points in discussing this issue. You first began with the ethical point of the freedom of the individual, and then the consequentialist or utilitarian benefits from it. But you also raised an important issue as you were finishing your opening comments, and that was after decades, and as you said, 2-3 centuries now, of attempts to demonstrate the logic and reasonableness of freedom of trade, we still see these cases being made for the opposite of it, and that is why. So I want to amplify some of your points, but let me sort of begin with the last one that you were raising implicitly, if I can. And that is that the reason why these arguments for trade barriers, trade restrictions, import duties constantly arise is part of the argument that one of our favorite French economists, Frederick Bastiat, pointed out well over 150 years ago, and that is what is seen and what is unseen. Most people see that a foreign good comes into the country, and as a consequence of it, if the American domestic competitor is not able to match his foreign rival's quality of product or price that he's offering his product for to the consumers, he loses some business. His market share decreases. The profit column may become losses. He might be sometimes driven out of business. And what is seen of that by the average individual, the citizen, is a loss of business, workers being let go, and this all seems to be a negative only for the benefit of the foreigner. The other element of this which is a theme also that Bastiat raised, is that as part of what is seen and what is unseen, it opens the door to the pandering and the goals of special interest groups. Those who, even if they understand the economic argument for freedom of trade, want to resist the loss of market share or profit margins that is being threatened by the foreign rival. And he runs to the government for the favored, privilege, special interest benefit, trade barrier, and import tax. So the combination of special interest politicking to narrow the field of competition to secure his own domestic market share, plus the fallacy of what is seen and what is unseen, those two things I think are constantly at work at making these arguments against free trade rise to the surface again. A number of freedom advocates pointed out that one of the frustrations we suffer is that there is no freedom gene. It's not that the idea and the understanding of liberty can just be transmitted to the next generation. The arguments for freedom in all of its facets, including freedom of trade, has to be learned anew by each generation in the face of these easily and understandable fallacies, as Bastiat emphasized. But having said that, let's now talk briefly about the two most fundamental arguments that you were raising at first. And that is first the ethical and moral case. If one believes in individual liberty, the right of the individual to live his life as he chooses, and to use the property and the wealth that he has honestly and peacefully acquired in any way that he chooses for his own mutual personal benefit, as long as it does not violate the rights of another, then one has to say that that individual has a right to associate and to trade and exchange with anyone that he chooses to improve his own circumstances. It could be the neighbor immediately next door. It could be the businessman in a shopping area in his own town or city. It could be a manufacturer who's offering a product to him on another part of the country of which he is a citizen, or it could be an individual who is a producer and a seller located in another foreign country halfway around the globe. If one believes in it as an ethical or moral principle, then that person should be allowed to trade and exchange with whomever he chooses for his own improvement through the mutual gains from trade. Either one believes in that liberty or one does not. That is a core and foundational principle that the advocate of liberty, of true liberalism, staunchly stands upon. The other element, let me suggest, is the other one that you were highlighting, and that is the consequentialist or utilitarian argument. The fact is, trade improves the material and cultural conditions of everyone in a society when in the long run. Let's think about the logic of this. Let us suppose, as economists have often pointed out, that each of us were producing in isolated, self-sufficient production. Our ability to satisfy our wants, our desires, needs be limited to what our own physical strength, our own knowledge, and the particular accident of the circumstances of the resources immediately around ourselves would enable us to apply to satisfy those ends, goals, purposes, and wants. We would live lives that were extremely nasty, brutish, and short if that was the condition of man, having to fend himself for all that he needs. The imagery, of course, is the famous one of Robinson Crusoe, shipwrecked on his with no other humans present. And if one remembers the movie, actually read The Kid, one realizes how difficult it was for him to basically meet his everyday needs of survival when dependent only on his own ability to produce that we needed and wanted to consume. Now, The advocates of freedom of trade from the time of Adam Smith on have pointed out that what permits is the following. There's someone else who has the ability to produce something that you want, that if you don't buy it, you must do without. And reciprocally, you might be able to produce something that the other fellow keeps for himself, which he would have to do without if not purchasing from you. Clearly, this is from trade. I give up something that perhaps I value less highly to have something I value more highly, which I cannot produce at all for myself. There's also the fact that maybe he can produce something that I could produce myself, but he could do it with a better quality or in less cost time for me to complete that task to move on to some other that I'd like to attempt to satisfy as well. Again, if someone can produce the product I'm interested in a better quality than my own labor can produce, or in less time than my own labor can produce, so that I have a better product and my time is partly freed up to do other things I want to do as well, surely there's mutual gains from trade. Now that argument is usually called the absolute advantage. But there's also the other argument, Jacob, which economists have called comparative advantage. And it's sort of represented in the idea of that old song from the musical, Annie Get Your Gun, where Annie Oakley and what ends up being her rival and her love interest in the movie have a competition. And each says in the song, anything you can do, I can do better. Anything you can do, I can do better. Now, what if you personally could do everything better, any potential trading partner? You can grow your food better and cheaper and in less time. You could make your own clothes better and cheaper and in less time. You could make the eyeglasses you need, the clothing you want, the items of your house, such as furniture, better and cheaper than anything your neighbor could do. If you could do everything better and cheaper than any potential trading partner, why would you bother to exchange at all with them, have any human association, as opposed to just being in blissful, self-sufficient, isolated of everything you need? For the simple fact is that while we are often good at many things, chances are we are better at one or a small handful of things. And the large comparative advantage from the time of David Ricardo and others in the early part of the 19th century is the idea that you will enhance both the quality and the quantities and the time savings of things that you want to achieve if you comparatively focus on what you are best at and buy other things from others in the society that you are less productive at. The standard example, Jacob, is the idea of the medical doctor who can do brain surgery. Now, he could do his own gardening work, mowing the grass, trimming the hedges, taking care of the flower beds, and so on. And he could hire a gardener to do this for him. But let us suppose that the gardener would take more time than the medical doctor could do his own gardening work. Should he ever hire the gardener? And the answer in this simple but crucial example that economists often use is that yes, if his services are more valuable in performing his medical specialization, doing his own home gardening, which he is more efficient at than the professional gardener whom he could do to hire it. Imagine that it would take him 4 hours to do his gardening, whereas it would take the gardener 6 hours to do the gardening. Let us suppose that in 4 hours, if he wasn't doing his own gardening, he could perform brain surgery. And each brain operation would pay him, let's say, $100. So that in the 4 hours, in not doing his own gardening, he was earned $400. Let us suppose that hiring the less efficient gardener, who does this as a living, but would take 6 hours to do what the doctor could do on his own property in 4 hours, charged $25 an hour. Well, 25 times 6 is $150. Clearly, it is advantageous of the doctor to hire the more and inefficient gardener to do that work. So his 4 hours of time is freed up, and to pay the gardener the $150 to earn the food, and therefore have a significant net gain in his salary by hiring the services of someone who is less efficient than themselves at one task, so he can specialize in what, in value terms, the market is saying more efficient at. Now, we can extend this to a whole variety of example, the manufacture of cars, the production of airplanes, growing of food, the making of clothes, the manufacture of eyeglasses, or understanding why women often work out of the home. Now, the women's liberation movement emphasized, you should be more than a housewife. And as a human being, maybe someone should want to have more of a fulfillment than being a wife and a mother. But even if that was not the case, let us suppose that there was a married woman who either had a natural skill or had earned a college degree before she got married and became the housewife, that the market valued enough that it would enhance her family's income above what she'd have to pay to a nanny to care for her children and clean up the house. Now, you could say that she certainly would love and care for her children better than even the most generous and kind-hearted nanny, but it would be advantageous for her to hire a nanny who is less loving and caring perhaps than herself with her own children, to free up her time to earn more money to enhance the household's economic situation. All of this explains, this idea of comparative advantage explains a whole bunch of these scenarios, including why, even though America can manufacture goods of various and sundry types, it can be advantageous to buy some of them from China, whereas that freeing up our time, our resources, our labor services to specialize in what both American consumers and other foreign consumers value more highly for us to specialize at, because that is what our relative or comparative advantage is directed at. Now, if you combine these arguments, one realizes that there is a mutual gain from trade from everyone, or as some economists used to say, even the poor and inefficient can find a place at the table of the global economy of trade and commerce by freeing the more efficient up to do what they are relatively best at. And those who are comparatively better at many things are gaining themselves by buying from the less what they could not do as effectively as doing what they're going to more narrowly specialize in. If one understands these arguments, all the arguments against free trade are lost. Now, if I can just continue with this just a little bit more, Jacob. But let's suppose the foreign producer, either based upon absolute advantage or comparative advantage, can beat the domestic manufacturer and seller. He doesn't only lose market share and profitability, he's driven out of business. What happens to the jobs? What happens to the businessman? What happens to the resources? Well, as long as we accept fundamental principle, and that is no matter how much our wants and desires are satisfied, there's always other wants and desires that we've not able to so far because our time has been scarce, our resources have been limited, our labor skills have had not the strength to do all that we would like to do. Every time that one is satisfied, or to a greater degree at least, it enables us to devote resources, manpower, capital to do other things. So let's do an example. Let us suppose that a foreign seller can sell a product in the United States for $25 that had been selling when the American producer produced it to cover his costs of production at $50. Now, it is true, if he can't devise an efficient way to match his foreign competitor, the $50 domestic seller will lose out to the $25 foreign rival, and he may go out of business. But what is unseen when you only focus on that is that the American consumers now have for $25 what previously had cost them $50. They now have that same good for half the price, and that leaves $25 in their pocket to spend in other directions on other things that previously could not afford to buy when they had to pay $50 for the domestic version. That increases the demand for alternative goods that now are financially in the reach of American buyers. That represents part of the alternative investment, profitability, and employment towards which the resources and labor will now move, given that the foreign competitor can do something better than that domestic rival. At the same time, the foreign seller does not give his goods for free. It's not just his benevolence. He wants the $25 at which he can efficiently offer it to the American consumer. What does he do with the $25 that he has earned? Invariably, the dollars come back either from him or to someone or from someone whom he sells those dollars to on a foreign exchange market back into the United States as a demand for other American goods. Trade is a two-way street. The man who grows food trades it for a suit of clothes. The man who makes a suit of clothes trades it for the food that he needs. Even though it's through the intermediaries of money, at the end of the day, trade for goods. The foreign seller wants dollars. He can have the financial wherewithal to buy something that he desires. The dollars will enable him to purchase. Either he or, as I say, someone who buys those dollars from him in the foreign exchange market, who wants dollars for that purpose, will spend them back in the United States. That increases investment and profitability and jobs in the export industry in the United States. The composition, the structure, the pattern of industries and employments may vary and change with these dynamic competitive occurrences and factors at work. But at the end of the day, there's no loss of potential business. There's no jobs that cannot be created and filled in alternative, dynamic, competitive directions. And as a cumulative result of this, at the end of the day, all of us end up with higher and standards of living and qualities of life than if we had attempted to operate with less trade or in blissful self-sufficient isolation.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up, first of all, Bastiat. I mean, I think there's nobody better than Bastiat to explain the virtues and benefits of free trade, and who pierces all the fallacies of the protectionist argument. So if people are not familiar with Bastiat, I'd highly recommend taking a look at his books. And also that the concept of comparative advantage is so important. Your examples are great. The one I usually think of is the law practice, that if, let's say, a lawyer is a sole practitioner and he's able to practice law and, as well as do all his own typing. And so a person comes in and says, I'd like to be your secretary, type up all your lawsuits and so forth. And so he says, okay, well, here's your test. And he or she does the test. And he says, no, wait a minute. I can type much faster than you. Well, is he better off doing all his own typing and practicing law? No. As you point out in the theory of comparative advantage, he's better off, even though he's better than the secretary at typing, he's better off practicing law and then letting her do the typing or him do the typing. Both sides benefit from that law of comparative advantage. Now, let me delve into a little bit about the trade deficit, because that's one of the big things that we're hit with, that we're importing more than what we're exporting, that there's a big trade deficit here, and this is going to, bankrupt America. And, Richard, this is so flagrantly fallacious. I really think that we would be much better off if the government didn't keep any statistics at all. I mean, if they're really, and I heard, I don't know if this is true, but I heard that Singapore did that Singapore just abolished all statistic gathering by the part of the government. Because let's face it, I mean, what do they need all those statistics for except to centrally manage the economy? If the government's not managing the economy, they don't need statistics. And one of the most damaging statistics is this so-called trade deficit. And, I go back to Bastiat. Bastiat would have made an argument like this. Suppose all of the car dealers in Japan and Germany offered every American a free car. Free Porsches, free Lexuses, Toyotas, Nissan. Everybody gets a free car. Well, you can imagine the status over here in the United States saying, oh, no, wait a minute. We would be importing millions and millions of dollars worth of cars. We demand the right to give them free cars too, so that the trade will be balanced. Otherwise, we'll have an enormous trade deficit. Or if they only sold the car to us for a penny. Right. I mean, it's so ludicrous. And the ludicrousness is really manifested here domestically. Because if we look at the United States, Richard, this is the greatest free trade zone in history. I mean, you've got an enormous geographic area where people are free to cross state borders and trade freely. Right. Now, do you pace the floors over the fact that there's this trade deficit between South Carolina and Virginia? Do you just get over there and rub your hands and say, oh my gosh, there's a trade deficit. We're going to go bankrupt. And now, I don't know which way the trade deficit works, whether it's in favor of South Carolina or favor of Virginia, but nobody cares. Nobody's pacing the floors because it's totally irrelevant.
Right.
All that's really relevant is that people are free to trade. And
Right.
nobody keeps track as to whether one state's gaining and one state's losing. And thank goodness for the framers that made the Constitution that way, because it's one of the major reasons why the American people have a much larger standard of living than the rest of the world. And so all we do is we apply that principle of free trade here domestically. Internationally, the principles still apply, and you could reverse it. You could say if the statists are right, if protectionism really benefits a nation economically, then why wouldn't it benefit a state? Maybe there should be state controls on trade and of course immigration as well. Think how much more how beneficial it would be for people in every state if they could erect trade walls that protects jobs, that protects the industries within that state from the competition of other states. I think instinctively we know that's just not the case. That once you start erecting these protectionist barriers, then you're really going to be lowering the standard of living of everyone. So our business is impacted by free and open competition, whether it's from people in other states or people from different communities or different nations. Absolutely. But that's what also keeps you on your toes, that you have to constantly improve your product. You have to satisfy consumer demand. And if you cannot do that, then that's probably a pretty good sign that you're in the wrong line of work and you need to move elsewhere.
Right. If I can just amplify a couple of things on this trade deficit business. The problem is that it only looks at certain items on the trade between the United States and obviously citizens of the United States and people in other countries. It would be like looking at the ledger book, and on one side of the ledger book is the full value of everything done, but on the other side of the ledger book, you don't have everything that is its flip side, so that it looks out of balance. What happens when you look at the balance of trade? Because it focuses on the buying and selling of actual finished goods and services for the most part. But there are other things that are in the balance of payments, that is the broader one, that shows that at the end of the day, the balance balances. And if I can give an example of this, in fact, one that I use in my classes, imagine that there's two fictitious countries, and we'll call them the United States and Japan. I just made those up, never heard of them before. Now, let us suppose that the United States buys $1,000 of finished goods and services, the Sony televisions, the Toyota cars, and so forth, Japan, and we spend $1,000 on this. Now, out of the $1,000 that the Japanese earn, suppose that they buy finished U.S. goods and services, $800. There's our balance of trade deficit. Why, we buy $1,000 worth of their goods, but they only buy $800 of our goods. They must be somehow taking advantage of us. We need to stop and ask ourselves, what are the options or alternatives for the Japanese who have earned $1,000 of revenue by selling us their goods to do with that net remaining amount of $200? Well, unless they want to put it up as wallpaper, right? Dollars as wallpaper. What are their options? Let me suggest the following. Direct investment. Let us suppose that they choose, after having bought $800 of our own goods, they decide to take 100 of their still remaining US dollars and directly invest it in the United States, building an automobile factory for which they pay land from an American land to buy it up. They hire an American construction company, primarily employing American workers to build the automobile factory. They then have to purchase machinery and equipment and tools, primarily from American capital goods manufacturers, out of that $100, and then at the same time hire the American workers to be on the assembly line and to do executive work. So $100 out of the 1,000 returns still to the U.S. as direct capital investment. Then there's also what's called indirect investment. That's nothing more and less than what happens when you or me or any of our viewers and listeners decide that out of the income they've earned, they're not going to spend all of it on desired goods and services. And they're not interested in starting up or partnering in a direct actual business investment project. Instead, they're going to take part of their earned income and put it in a savings account, some financial institution, a bank, that will then act as an intermediary to pool your savings and mine and funnel it out to credit-worthy borrowers who want to undertake it for investment purposes that justify them paying the interest to the bank to do so. And out of that interest that the bank earns, we get paid our interest payments for having made our savings available. The foreign earner of dollars may very well decide that the safety and security of financial markets are greater in the United States than in their home country or some other country. They might decide that the rate of interest that can be earned on leaving money on deposit in an American bank is greater than what they can earn in their own or some other foreign bank. And therefore they take, let's say, another $75 out of the $1,000 and deposit it in an American financial institution, and therefore by that increasing the pool of savings in the United States that and other financial institutions have available to fund out domestically for American investment projects and capital formation. Now, the attentive listener or viewer would notice $800 for finished American goods and services, $100 of direct investment building like an auto in the United States, or $75 of indirect investment left on deposit with an American financial institution to earn interest, which increases the American savings pool for domestic capital formation. But they might say, well, scratching their head, but wait, what happened to the remaining $25 out of the 1,000? Well, maybe one of the Japanese earners of the dollars decides that he wants to buy goods made in Europe instead of the United States. But you spend euros, not dollars, within the European Union. So he will go to the foreign exchange market and offer to sell his $25 of dollars for euros. And someone who will sell those euros to him at the market price of one currency for another, in exchange for the dollars. Now, why does he want the dollars? Why is he giving up euros? Because he has some use for dollars. He must either want to buy American goods and services, want to directly invest in the U.S. economy, or he wants dollars to put into an American financial institution to earn interest income, the way you and I put money in a bank or a financial institution. And then 800 plus 100 plus 75 plus 25 equals 1,000. At the end of the day, the balance of payments balances. There is no imbalance in the trade between the U.S. and other countries. Those are basically the broad permutations that spending dollars that a foreigner has earned in terms of options for him to use those dollars. And as a consequence, this fear of trade deficits is absurd. The other thing, if I can just add one more point here, the presumption here is that America gains from its exports, and that somehow imports are something we have to take to be able to sell our goods. The opposite is the case. The value of trade, whether with your neighbor or someone who's a seller on the other side of the globe, is not what we sell, but what we buy. The gain from trade is the import, the good that we cannot produce for ourselves, the good that we cannot make in terms of the better quality or at the lower cost or price, or that enables us to free up our times to do other things. The benefit is what we buy from others, the import, which they can offer us on better terms or quality or price than we can do for ourselves. The price of buying these things is making something that we can give in exchange to get what we want. The value is imports. The cost is exports. I sell my labor services to the Citadel as a professor of economics. Why? Earn a money income. Why do I want a money income? Because in the marketplace, that money income enables me to enter as a consumer and buy all the other things that I cannot make for myself, or not in the same quality, or not as a lower price, or not as a time cost. I export my labor services to earn an income, to have the financial wherewithal to import all the things that I desire that others can do better than me. If that applies for me as a citizen in the United States, it applies between me and everyone else in the world with whom I trade. That is the gain from trade, not the export. That's merely the payment of the valued import.
All right, that's a great economic analysis, and one that we could wrap up with. But let me make a few more small points here, and that is that with any trade war that's going to start, with the increasing of tariffs like on Japan and China or whoever, it's obviously going to be retaliated against. And yes. So you're going to be, no other country is going to sit there and say, oh, well, okay, you can raise your tariffs and we won't raise tariffs back on you. So that's going to have an adverse impact on all the people who are accustomed to selling their goods and services to those foreign countries. And that's one of the things that I think we should emphasize, Richard. The people who pay the biggest price for these trade wars and protectionism are the people at the bottom of the economic ladder. That over here they're forced to pay higher prices than they otherwise would when they could pay lower prices because foreigners are willing to offer them these goods and services at lower prices. But then on the reverse side, when all the jobs start getting lost and people laid off because the other side's retaliating, that's going to be hurting the poor as well. And finally, let me say this, that whenever your welfare warfare state starts to collapse, and that's what's really happening in America, they start looking for scapegoats.
Yes.
Illegal immigrants are a popular scapegoat because they can't defend themselves, but then it's the Japanese, it's the Chinese, it's the proverbial foreigner that's causing all our problems. And so what Americans really need to be doing is looking at the root causes of their economic problems, their financial problems. And that is this giant apparatus known as the welfare warfare state. That's the root of the problem. That's what needs to be dismantled. The scapegoating doesn't do anything positive. And I'll let you have the final word.
Yeah, I would just say that you're absolutely right. Just the other day, my wife was accusing me of not properly washing some dishes. And I said, it's Hornberger's fault. I was looking for a scapegoat.
You're becoming just like them, Richard.
but I think that is fundamentally the case, is that people begin looking for excuses. It's just another example of like when domestic problems go wrong, some countries have resorted to war to distract their citizens from the domestic failures of that government's policies. When things go wrong at home, it's easier to point to a foreign competitor, a foreign producer, a foreign supplier, that they're the cause of all of our problems. Fundamentally, the problems lie at home and need to be cured at home. That is the issue. And just one other point is that, you know, the first country other than the United States to institute real free trade was Great Britain in the early decades of the 19th century. They unilaterally eliminated their agricultural and virtually all of their manufacturing barriers and tariffs and restrictions. Unilateral trade, even though when the British did this in the 1840s, all their other trading partners, for the most part, particularly in Europe, maintained their trade barriers. The argument is that if free trade is good, if it is the reasonable and rational policy for anyone, buy low and sell high, even if your trading partners irrationally, illogically, and to their own harm, maintain their own trade barriers, there is no reason to follow their policy to impose counter trade barriers and to harm ourselves and deny us goods that they can still sell to us at better prices and at superior quality than if we did them at home.
Yeah, that's a great example you brought. You were talking about Cobden and Bright and the free trade movement. I recall that it was the poor people that were really leading that movement. And you pointed out to me once that picture where they had the cannon and they're approaching the British government, all the poor people in the Anti-Corn Law League, and on the sign that said "Free Trade or This," and they were demanding you have free trade in this country, or you're going to receive the what comes out of this cannon.
Or the one other one is that there would be graffiti written on the walls of buildings, again by the low-income people who were starving, and they said, "I be protected and I be starved."
That's great. All right. On that note, this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. Hope you enjoyed the show. Richard, enjoyed it as always.
Great time, and thank you again to the viewers and listeners for taking a little bit of time out of their day to participate in these ideas.
Yep. We'll see you next week.